Hi, I'm Jeff Franke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. When it comes to securing the industrial enterprise, a great deal of focus is being paid to what might seem like the little things. This is passwords, logins, or credentials that are used to limit access to networks or data platforms. The problem has been the continued use of weak, easy-to-remember passwords and login workarounds that have created vulnerabilities and as a result contributed to numerous successful malware, phishing, and ransomware attacks. The response has been the infusion of protocols meant to strengthen these soft spots, but measures such as double-factor authentication and zero-trust access have been met with resistance in the aforementioned workarounds. The irony is that the need for, and biggest obstacle to, strategies like double-factor authentication or zero trust stem from the same source: people. Capterra, a provider of software selection guides, found that 99% of those who have adopted zero trust strategies feel it has improved their company's cybersecurity posture. However, the research goes on to state that restricting data access without impacting workflows, the ability to develop new security policies, and selecting zero trust vendors continue to be significant obstacles in adopting these zero trust strategies. So the tools are there, but we need to figure out more effective ways of using them. Before we talk to our guest for this episode, we're excited to announce that Security Breach is being sponsored by Rockwell Automation. For more information on their cybersecurity solutions, you can go to rockwellautomation.com. And here to discuss some potentially new and better strategies around establishing zero trust network access solutions is Tom Seago, CEO and co-founder of Blastwave. Tom, thanks so much for joining us today. You know, we're seeing a lot of commonalities in some of these really prominent industrial attacks, with the root cause going back to a lot of stuff like logins and credentials and things like that. What do you see going on here? First of all, why does this continue to be such a big vulnerability? And what are the hackers doing to get access to a lot of this information?
Yeah, well, I think the reason why you see credentials as the kind of primary insertion point is that, you know, that's like the front door to your assets, your environment. And so it makes sense that the easiest way into your critical assets and data repositories would be through that front door and be using credentials to try to find that way, because it's very easy for someone to authenticate as impersonating somebody else and do an account takeover to gain that unauthorized access. Now, your question about what tactics do hackers use to get that information, there are a slew of them. I'll just name a couple. So credential stuffing, which is a situation in which credentials are used from one attack to another attack, and it's usually automated using bots. There's also brute force methods, which is trying all the popular your passwords, and that actually is more effective than you might think. And then you get into a little bit more targeted types of approaches like phishing, which I think people are familiar with, where a fake website tries to pretend to be the real website to extract your credentials. Another area that I think is important to think about is social engineering. And social engineering is when someone tries to trick you into giving you your credentials. There's also key logging, default passwords, APIs with hard-coded credentials. The dark web has actually a credential marketplace. So there's a lot of opportunity for people to do this. And the reason it is because it works and it doesn't cost a lot of money.
Talk about that a little bit. That's something we haven't heard before, the dark web and the credential marketplace. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there are groups, that essentially perform these series of attacks. And when they're able to get into an Active Directory or directory services for one company, what they can do is they can download those credential files, and they can post those on the dark web for a price. And they can separate it by company. And you would be surprised what is available. I was talking to an insurance company professional who was mentioning that he goes to the dark web periodically to see what kind of credentials are up from his company.
Wow. So are these kind of like admin type logins, or are these individual logins, passwords?
It's all the above. They're typically doing credential harvesting to allow people to get the maximum dollars per credential. So if it is to a person or if it is to a title, those are typically going to receive a lot more money than just a flat file.
Yeah. This really kind of reinforces a couple things we've talked about before in the program. Number one, hackers would rather log in than hack in if they possibly can. And also just how complex these organizations are getting. What you're saying basically is we've got one organization or group that's going to go in and get the credentials, and then they're out. They're going to hand it off to somebody else who specializes in what to do basically once they get into the network. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's like a supply chain almost, right?
Yeah.
You've got these specialists who perform different functions, and they can monetize each other's value better by breaking that into these specialty groups.
It's interesting. And I know we're going to get there at some point, so feel free to bring it in here. But when we look at these credentials and these logins and these passwords getting out there, is this just an employee training issue? Is this a cultural issue? What do we need to address here? I mean, we've got some great tools like double-factor authentication and zero trust, which I know you're an expert in, but what does it take to really get people to buy it and use these tools?
Yeah. Well, my answer to your question, does this come down to a training issue? Absolutely not, is my opinion. I know this is controversial, but I think people are going to click. People are going to be tricked, and the adversaries are going to stay one step ahead of a cohort of people that they're going to be able to exploit. I mean, I have seen statistics from IBM and others who show that human error is responsible between 88% and 95% of attacks. You're never going to get rid of human error. Humans are always going to be the weakest link. Now, I would also see, you mentioned multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication. I don't know if you've ever seen this done before, but this is really interesting. If you watch the process that a hacker uses for a man in the middle or woman in the middle attack to, again, essentially serve as an intermediary between the user and the valid site, they can actually exploit and grab a token using MFA, valid MFA credentials, and then put that into the browser to gain unauthorized access. In fact, I have a video that kind of shows that working. That's about, I don't know, maybe a minute or so, and it's pretty eye-opening. So MFA can't solve that problem either, and this is really more a weakness in relying so heavily on browsers for security. So now let me mention a couple of things on the human side. I used to play professional poker, and one of the key things around playing professional poker is I make money when my opponent makes mistakes. It's that simple. And so the way to make money is to have your opponent have many, many more decisions, because the more decisions they make, the more opportunity they have to make mistakes. And it's the same with security. If you have the user required to go through many, many steps or have to make many decisions, it gives them an opportunity to make a mistake. And so I prefer to think about ways to engineer out actions and decisions that humans have to make so that there are fewer and fewer opportunities for them to make that mistake.
Wow, that's incredible. Now, another thing that you talk a lot about is zero trust, and you've brought up a term that I thought was really interesting and called device cloaking. Maybe you could explain that to us a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the first steps in what's called the cyber kill chain, which was kind of coined by Lockheed Martin, is called reconnaissance. So just think about the analogy. If you're going to go rob a bank, are you going to just walk in, point a gun at someone and go rob the bank like that? No. You're going to perform reconnaissance. You're going to case the joint, as they say. You're going to figure out where all the cameras are. Where are the guards? What's the guard rotation? When do they shift change? You're going to look at where's the vault? Who has keys to the vault? Is it multiple keys? So you're going to do all this kind of reconnaissance. And once you've gone through that process and identified all the strengths and weaknesses of a given system, then you're in a position to craft the payloads, the deployment and weaponization techniques to deploy that malware and achieve your objective. In the case of cyber, if you can stop them from even being able to see or detect your critical assets, it makes it darn near impossible for them to perform that first step of reconnaissance.
Okay.
So you can stop the kill chain by cloaking these assets so that they don't even know what vulnerabilities exist to be exploited, right? And so the types of scanning that are done are things like Nmap scanning, pings, etc. And so if a company can make their critical assets unresponsive to those pings and Nmap scans, then it's going to make the hacker's job so much more difficult. And likely what they're going to do is just move on to a softer target, because unless they're specifically targeting an organization for some reason other than money, then they would just move on.
So in drawing a parallel to the industrial sector then, would this be taking a lot of those operational technology assets, the machines on the floor, if you will, and applying the same approach?
Yeah, and I think in the case of industrial, it's a totally different environment. Industrial security is so different than IT security. And this is an area where there's a lot of improvements that need to be made to catch up to where enterprise ICT security is. And it should surprise nobody that manufacturing just overtook financial services as the most attacked industry. Yep. And if you've been in a plant, if you've been in a water facility, you will know why. Because the equipment they're using is typically lasts 30 to 50 years. Okay, not 3 to 5 years. It's not updated. It's not running modern Linux. It also can't be patched in many cases. And without spending 8 or 9 figures, they can't modernize a plant all at once. It'd be too capital intensive. So a lot of these requirements are so different. These plants also are what are called flat networks, where if you get into one side, you can actually traverse all the way to the other. You can do what's called east-west movement and lateral movement. So if you can somehow contain that in a way that isolates these HMIs and data historians and all these things right below the DMZ, you can much better secure your OT environments.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, and it was brought up by a previous guest too, talking about once they get in, sort of halting those lateral movements of the attack. I'd like to get your thought a little bit on something else, Tom. Right now, the industrial sector is actually in an investment phase. There's a lot of new technologies that are coming in, more automation, more IIoT type of technologies that are being adapted and utilized. What this is creating is sort of an inventory issue for a lot of security professionals. We've got so much stuff going on, they can't always keep track of everything and therefore putting in the right defense measures. What advice might you be able to offer in terms of, first of all, you got to know where all this stuff is, and then how do you go about sort of implementing some of the strategies that you've been talking about here?
Yeah, I think if you go to the doctor, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to take your blood pressure, your weight, they're going to measure your heart rate. So you gather this basic diagnostic information. So you need to do an assessment first before you go apply any controls. Yeah. And typically that assessment is also going to prioritize the most important security controls that you can deploy that give you the biggest bang for the buck. So we've partnered with an outfit called Gray Matter Systems that does a superb job at doing these assessments that helps OT organizations prioritize the list of security controls. I think the other thing that's important is to think about companies, vendors that really understand manufacturing, really understand OT, because as you point out, there are many more, there's a proliferation of data sources now that are being installed in these environments. And that's great because digital transformation and the fourth industrial revolution relies on data to help create insights that can make operations more efficient. They can improve quality. They can also prevent unplanned downtime. And if you can then have a security structure that prevents unplanned downtime because you're so much harder for hackers to interfere with, that's going to lead to the bottom line. So there's a lot of both offensive and defensive capabilities that security providers can do. They can deliver digital transformation tools, and they can also prevent people from hacking your system and getting in and causing disruptions.
Yeah, I think some of the bigger areas, there's the big three in the industrial sector, and it's probably a lot for any other sectors as well. When we talk about, you mentioned phishing attacks, planting the malware, and then the big one that's getting a lot of headlines right now is ransomware. Are you seeing any new players out there, any new strategies or tactics that the industrial sector really needs to be focused on right now?
Yeah, well, this all ties together. Yeah. As you have more complex digital devices spread throughout these environments, the attack surface has gone up quite a bit. And ransomware is just like any other piece of malware, except it's really tailored and purpose-built to make money. And the ransomware that a lot of people are familiar with are around data breaches for Equifax or Uber or some of these other companies where they expose customer data, which isn't great, but that's different than ransoming, kind of locking up a key piece of technology and infrastructure that your production facility depends on. So if you can cripple these key components, you can demand much larger ransom payments. And it just so happens, this is what the data shows. The average ransom demand in the first 6 months of this year exceeded $2 million for manufacturing, whereas the rest of the industry average was $900K. And by the way, that's up from 540, 360 to 115 over the last 4 years. So the situation has gotten a lot worse, and everybody's basically focusing on ransomware because that's where you make the most money.
Yeah, makes sense. So I ask everybody who comes on Security Breach this question. We talk about ransomware, and it's becoming a much grayer area than it was at one point in time. But when you are hit, what's your advice? Do you pay the ransom or do you try to hold out?
Definitely don't pay the ransom. I think the thing is that the government just brought down, the Department of Justice just brought down the Hive ransomware group. And, there are a lot of people who are working together in the security community to help each other because we've got to band together. We've got to share information. This is a community. This is not we're not an island we're not an island. So I think that you should not pay the ransom, but what you should do is you should have that health checkup performed. You should be proactive. You should have data backup and recovery systems in place. You should do tabletop exercises to think through, if we are attacked, what do we do? What things do we need in place to recover quickly and to not have to pay that ransom? Because if you start paying ransom, it's going to get worse. And there's nothing that says once you pay a ransom that they actually have to unlock and provide the encryption keys, although most of the time they do.
Yeah, no, that's the trick right there. So one of the things that is kind of in my opinion, and I know people disagree, because you mentioned the Department of Justice and some other things, I think our industry really lacks transparency. I think there is some dialogue, and I think it's improving, but I don't think there's enough of it. Now, I'm not advocating embarrassing individuals. If they were the victim of a phishing scheme, I'm not saying don't put your company at risk from a stock perspective and losing confidence, but I think we need to share more information about these attacks. What are your feelings?
Absolutely. I think there's sharing at two levels. There's sharing within industry groups about the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are being used, and that we can then kind of coalesce around ways to address that. And then there's also public disclosures. And I think you can do both. I think the public disclosures can be made in such a way that it doesn't undermine your security posture, but it does help people understand that this is a real problem. That there was a statistic I read this week that said 93% of manufacturing companies have been hit in the last 12 months. Yep. Now, I can guarantee you haven't read about that. And I think people are worried about the perception of this, much like people used to be worried about the perception of mental health. People didn't talk about mental health 20, 30 years ago. Today, because of the pandemic and a lot of things happening, people talk about mental health now, and that's a good thing. And I think people should be talking about the reality that these organizations are facing. so that it can also justify investment into tighter security controls. The board is only going to invest in these things if they think the problem's real. And if the public's aware of it, it's going to create pressure from shareholders.
No, couldn't agree more. And I think that's a great analogy too, as far as the mental health perspective. All right, Tom, we've talked a lot about the bad guys. Let's talk about the good guys here a little bit. Maybe you can fill us in on some of the things that Blastwave is doing to help kind of support the industrial sector here.
Well, I think what we've done is we've tried to focus our solution for the industrial segment so that it adapts to the realities. It helps these manufacturing, power, and water companies leapfrog up the scale towards a zero trust architecture. It addresses things like multi-factor authentication that's I'm going to say phishing resistant. It helps provide bubbles around your critical assets so that you can't move laterally like we talked about. It makes it so that people can remotely access anything anywhere in the world in a way that is not visible, it's undiscoverable. So we've also built in unidirectional control for policies. So you don't need to spend money on what are called data diodes and things like that. So it's really purpose-built for these environments. And when we run into prospects, the response that we get, I got this morning at 7 o'clock call. You're the solution we've been dreaming of. So I think that's exciting to me because at the end of the day, I want to be solving this problem. I spent my first decade in factories. I was at Caterpillar and Eli Lilly, and I know what these environments are like. And it's definitely not like a data center. It's not like enterprise. So.
Absolutely. No, great points. So wrapping things up a little bit here, Tom, as we look forward, maybe the next 12 or 18 months, are there any trends that you're seeing, positive or negative, that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, I would say, I think there are several trends. I think digital transformation is something that's been happening in the IT space. It's happening in OT. And the reason this is occurring is because we have this phenomenal wave that's happening today around artificial intelligence. If you look at OpenAI and ChatGPT, what's possible now is so different than what was possible 5-10 years ago. And so the way you make those tools work is you've got to use rich data sets. And these data sets are available, and they've been available. It's just that there hasn't been a secure way to get that data from all these distributed repos to the cloud and other services to create insights. And so, I think AI is something that's absolutely game changing right now, but it relies on that data, which relies on a secure connection both back and forth between the plant floor and the cloud. And that's the hard problem that needs to be solved. I think another area that is, I think in the next 12 to 18 months is important, and this may surprise you. The federal government's actually leading on this, which I can't remember saying that ever, maybe. But the federal government with Executive Order 14028 and OMB 2209 memorandum, those things are requiring that federal organizations, institutions, and put in place zero trust architecture by the end of 2024. Okay. That is an extremely aggressive timeline. Yeah. And that includes things like phishing resistant MFA. It includes things like adopting the 7 pillars of a zero trust architecture. And I think that is going to put a lot of pressure on vendors to come up with ways to support those initiatives, because the government can't do it by themselves. So I think AI and then this push for zero trust architecture that the government's leading are going to be two catalysts that are going to greatly change the landscape in the next 12 to 18 months. I also think manufacturing is going to be catching up very quickly to enterprise IT. Because that manufacturing just overtook financial services, that's firing a warning shot to boards, executives everywhere, that they can no longer keep their head in the sand or no longer choose to turn a blind eye to the security risks they have today.
No, and I think that's a great point. You mentioned the pressure that this is going to put on agencies or organizations that are working with the government. I think it's positive pressure because that's going to potentially trickle down into the rest of industry as well if they want to be the tier 2 and tier 3 supplier for those government contracts.
And the best thing I think about the way the government's done this is they weren't prescriptive. Okay. When I worked at Eli Lilly, I also ran an environmental controls organization, and I dealt with OSHA and the EPA and all these things. And oftentimes they would have these prescriptive regulations that would just tie our hands. And, the government's never going to be on the leading edge in terms of technology. So better yet, put in place frameworks and guidelines that any, technologies can evolve to meet. And I think that's a much better way to help everybody move forward.
Interesting. One last thing I'd like to get your take on, Tom, and I know this is a little bit of a wild card. At the beginning of the whole conflict in Ukraine with Russia, there was a lot coming out of there in terms of new developments from a cybersecurity perspective, new tactics being put out. It's been a little bit quieter lately. Have you heard of anything else that's come out of there in terms of different entities, different targets that could impact the industrial sector or potentially beyond?
It's an unreported story. It's not warfare. By definition, is where people take the gloves off, right? It's all about winning. And one of the reasons why I co-founded the company was reading Kim Zetter's and Andy Greenberg's articles in Wired magazine about the attack on the Ukraine electric grid before Christmas, and realizing from my history at Eli Lilly that, oh my God, all these factories around the world, our entire industrial sector is behind the curve. And we need to do something about this. So it was a call to arms for me and our team. Those things are absolutely going on right now between Russia and Ukraine, but they're not being written upon. Right now, there's so much that's in your face. There's attacks happening in the hospitals and all kinds of other things that are really devastating. But the cyber story really isn't getting told. And I'll tell you what, there's a lot of activity going on because it's cheap. It's asymmetric, right? You don't need F-35s and you don't need, advanced Leopard 2 tanks to do this. And hacking is just cheap. And it's a way to disrupt their critical infrastructure. It's a way to disrupt power. It's a way to disrupt their services. It's also a way to gain information about the enemy's plans and strategies. So it's absolutely going on, but it's just not being reported because it's hard to detect.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense. Tom, this has been fantastic. Anything we haven't covered that you'd like to get to?
No, I just think that, as a vendor, we are part of a community and we have collectively a problem to help solve. And we need to work with partners and not worried about, how any party gets paid or how much money we make or anything else. We have a higher objective, which is to protect our critical infrastructure and enable these companies to unlock digital transformation to make themselves more profitable, higher quality, and lower downtime.
Thanks, Tom. For more information on the work BlastWave does, you can check them out at blastwave.com. Thanks for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Tom Segal, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.